got Derek Van Riper, and we have Mike Gianella. DVR Mike, thank you so much for joining today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us as a part of it.
Yeah. So Mike, by the way, internet looks great. I know you had some worries about that. Looks wonderful. We're good there. DVR, I'm happy you were able to make it. I know the timing is weird. If you need to go at any point during this, just let me know. Okay. Just let me know.
We're on the clock, but I think we're okay for hopefully a couple more weeks.
All right. Well, still, it's a very exciting time, and I'm happy that you're here. But I can talk to Mike for hours, so don't worry.
Is this your first, Derek, or are you?
Yeah. The Van Riper family is growing. We are having our first baby, so it's any week now. Really, is where we're at.
Oh my gosh. This is why, by the way, you're wondering, wait, why isn't DVR hosting? He's the GOAT hosting. I know, but we gotta let DVR have a moment here. And what is that mug? What was that?
That's Sister Michael from the show Dairy Girls.
Dairy Girls. Oh, I love it. She's my favorite character. Absolutely. Wonderful. All right, so what we're going to be doing here, we're going to be talking about something I think is overlooked a little bit in the industry, where we talk about generally the players we want by round. But if you're in a 15-teamer, sometimes you're picking, you have 30 picks until your next one. You don't get to play the round game. You actually have to think differently than if you're in the 1 spot versus the 8 spot versus the 15 spot. The same players are just not there for you. So I really wanted to take this panel to consider that. I realized my mic fell, and that's why I didn't sound as good. Oh no, you know how I feel about that. All right, so we're going to be doing that for the next hour here, and I want to start with you, DVR, on this first question, which is KDS entering 2023 now. Just in general, we're going to go into the draft strategies for each one, but is there a draft slot you're feeling, yeah, you know what, that is the one I do want to go for most in 2023?
So for me, the way I like to build teams is I want to make sure I address all of the roto categories within the first 8 rounds of a draft. 8 to 10 rounds, usually the goal. I don't think there's one spot that I'm automatically locked into this year. I think I prefer an end to being in the middle, which is probably a big part of what we're going to talk about, is that the relative positioning in the round really shapes the types of decisions you have to make. So if you're in the middle, like you're saying, you can play that game of chicken with each and every player type that you're going after, because you're not waiting as long between turns. When you're on an end, you have to be a little more firm in your decision. You have to be more willing to jump players above where they tend to go, and you have to be a little clearer on your plan going in from the beginning. So I prefer an end to the middle. I don't think the middle is that bad. I do think there's a little bit of a funky thing that happens in the later part of round 2 of a 15-team league draft. It seems like you're getting some players in that like 5 to 7 pick window that are young guys that haven't done it before, like Michael Harris, over a full season. So you feel like you're taking on some risk there, or you're taking the first catcher off the board in JT Realmuto, or you're taking the very first closer off the board in Edwin Diaz. And none of those things are things that I really want to do in building a team. So if I don't have the actual first pick where I get the 2 together every time after the first time, I'm trying to avoid those first few picks in the draft order. That's the weird twist for me, at least, about 2023 so far.
Sure. How about you, Mike?
I generally don't have a strong preference. So it's funny. Last year in a lot of leagues, I was targeting Mike Trout, and he was going like 10, 11. So I kind of wanted to pick there, thinking, you know what, I'm going to get Trout. Or is it going even later? I'm like, you know what, that's kind of the high end for him. I can get him 10 or 11. I don't really see that this year. I don't see a player like that I'm like, oh gosh, like he's number 1 or close to number 1 for me, but he's going to fall. I do generally agree with you, DVR. I think that I don't necessarily have a preference for being in the middle. I feel like it's too agnostic. I'd prefer to be at the back or the front. One thing I'd add is that in Tout Wars, which is OBP, I find being way at the front pays off, because those on-base players tend to really like pay off and be high-end guys like at the top. Like someone like Aaron Judge this year, I have the number 1, or I have the option for it. I really want that 1, because putting else aside, what you think Judge is going to do, that on-base is going to really make him float to the top.
So what's interesting is, I've been calling it about 20 hitters or so that I feel are a step above the others. And especially somebody who doesn't like taking pitchers early, it's more of that. I just want to make sure I have hitters that I like. I find that if we have 30 picks to go in the first 2 rounds, then let's say I do go for Judge. I say, I want to have one of those first couple of ones. Maybe that's Trey Turner I'm going for, Jose Ramirez, because third base is such a premium that I would lean on Jose Ramirez because it would be hard to get a third baseman that you like coming after that. Riley's gone, Machado's gone, Arenado likely gone too before the 30th pick in NFBC as well. Devers as well. So going after Jose Ramirez doesn't put you in a hole when it comes to position scarcity. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. But really thinking about that is what kind of pairing do I want to start my draft with? What do I feel is putting myself in a position to adapt to the draft later on? And I think I'm actually leaning to, my 15 teamers. I want to be at the end because I want those first two picks to be that good. And if, I'm looking at ADP right now, this is just general. I know we talk about like gladiator drafts and we talk about draft champions, all this stuff. I generally feel the first couple rounds should be somewhat similar in a lot of them. We don't have main event stuff quite yet, but I'm seeing by the end, by 30th is Arenado. You have Lindor, you have Michael Harris as hitters here. But then you get to Altuve, Semien, Arozarena, Varsho around the 30s. And for me, if I can make my first two picks a stud first baseman and Mookie Betts, like Mookie Betts is at 11 right now, and then you have Freddie Freeman or so, that maybe can come around. Maybe you can get Austin Riley with that. You can do a pairing of Mike Trout and Riley. I actually do think there is a better pairing in that way. You can make an argument. Look, I like those ones in the 30s, so I'll be happy to get that instead of what would be around 45 or so as my third. If you guys are avoiding the middle, which I understand, you say I really want to be able to attack one thing or another. When I was describing those two, is there really a preference of saying I want the first three picks or I want the last three picks? Mike, we'll start with you.
I don't know, and I think some of it is my approach might be different than others. I generally am a get your best value in the first 10 rounds or so.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm comfortable. Like I think as DVR, I'm a big value guy. So I feel comfortable, especially after the first 2 or 3 rounds, feel like, you know what, I'm going to get my values. People have different opinions. Like an interesting example is somebody like Matt Olson. I was looking at his ADP and I think he's like 41, 43, somewhere in there. That's about where I have him. I think I have him literally the same value. What that means to me is I'm not going to get Matt Olson because unless the draft goes exactly the way his ADP does, which it won't, I'm going to wind up with somebody else there because I'll probably have somebody at like 35, 36 who is mine. So that's a large part of it. Those first couple rounds, like I do agree with you, Nick, those are sort of important. You want to stake out your claim. I think to your point, like I'm almost making your argument for you, which is 15, 16, where everything is almost chalk or very close to chalk. You are going to pretty much get like the players that are the most valuable there, and everyone's going to agree. You get to 30, I think you're already at the point where there's some wiggle room and you might get like 25 or 26 on your list or 27 in a sharper draft just because people have some differences of opinion. So I don't know if I have a preference for that reason, just because I feel like the values up front are almost all the same, and it's not till the third round that you start to see a little bit of that divergence.
Sure. Yeah. DVR.
I think I like the back just a little bit more so far based on how the boards are playing. So much can change between now and March. One thing that I've been comfortable doing this year, maybe it's because of the rule changes where stolen bases should be a little easier to come by. I'm okay not having as many steals at the beginning of my roster. I could live with that. I had a team I built from the 15 spot recently. It's a slow draft, so it's still happening. But I went Burns Trout because I wanted to get a pitcher early. If you like early pitching, you want to have one of Burns or Cole, you want to have a late position in the first round. You don't play that way. In this contest, I wanted to play it that way.
Kidding.
But I went Burns, Trout, Will Smith, Ryan Presley, Alex Bregman. I mean, I have 0 steals in those first 3 hitters, and some people would freak out about that. The thing you have to think about if you build a team that way from that draft position is where are the steals going to come from? What types of players are going to be there at 75 and 76 and at 105 and 106? Do you trust those players to fill the categorical needs? So when I think about where I want to be in the draft order and how I like to build rosters, I'm looking several rounds down the board just to make sure that I can end up with the balanced foundation I want eventually. I used to just prioritize getting it so much faster. There used to be this pressure. I want to get at least 50 homers and at least 50 steals from my first 2 hitters. That's great if you have that. But if the best players available are guys that hit a lot of home runs and don't run. If you get 70 homers and 5 steals, you can still get the steals you need later on. There's no rule that says you have to have them in those first couple of picks. So thinking a lot about that, the quality of those players late in the first round. I think this is what you were getting at, Nick. The value you're getting from like a Betts Freeman combo compared to the great player you get at the beginning of round 1, and then that little bit of a question mark that you might get at 2, or being nudged into taking a pitcher if you don't want one in that range. That's not necessarily the start that you want to play with if your strength is finding a lot of value in the pitching pool throughout the middle and later rounds.
Right. And it's, I do this, which is kind of shocking. I'm going to do this. I coach basketball, and we do a draft for it. And I have, they have a whole tryout and everything like that. You understand the players. And what is something that we're able to do, because it's a little bit of a smaller league, so we can understand how we think the flow will go. We have the ratings and everything like that. We can understand where the gaps of value are really quickly. So when it comes to, we don't know where we're going to be beforehand. Unfortunately, we just kind of arrive there. It is take the first pick. They don't, it's not like this where everybody's given such a heads up and it's a lot more to it. So what we have to do is plan. Okay, if we're in the number 1 spot, this is the person we're going to take first overall, but that means we don't expect any of these here. So then we have to take this, and how it shifts everything that we do. We need a big man. Where's the big man going to be? It's going to be over here, right? And it's so important, I think, for any league that you're in, that with each draft spot where certain aspects that you like are. And it's important that it's you, because it's not ADP. You don't just want to follow ADP and say, oh, okay, I need a steal guy. Who is it? Okay, fine. I guess I take it here. It's about having the plan of adjustments before you start the whole thing. And then you'll see, like, wait a second, I really like being around 15 or so, because I like the 15, 16. That sets me up in such a way that I enjoy. Or maybe you look, I want to be able to get Jose Ramirez if I can, because I really like third baseman there. Or if I'm going for Aaron Judge, how does that shape which outfielders I go for? Sure, I like to get Eloy Jimenez, but maybe I don't need to do that now. And I need to then shift that one. So it's really important to not really just look at the ADP number and say, like, well, I like this guy generally in the 7th, 8th round. It's okay, if I am in a position to get this guy, that means I'm not in a position to get that guy, and I need to really adjust that. So unfortunately, it's only January 27th, and we haven't yet been able to really piece that together. But that is the fun stuff, I think, that I need to spend more time on in February. And I generally try to do for the ultimate draft guide that I put out every March, is really analyzing from what position does this entail for me as a drafter, because I can say, I generally like him in the 7th round or so, but then you're in the back end of the 7th and that guy's already gone in the middle of the 7th round, and you can't do that. So we're going to try to piece that together a little bit as we go through this. But I think that's really the point we want to hammer in during this panel. Now, when it comes to starting pitcher, I know I joke about this all the time. Don't draft starting pitchers, but I'm not going to sit here and say, like, it's really nice to have Garrett Cole. It does change how I draft. I've actually done drafts where I took a start in the first 2 rounds, just kind of to zig where I think everyone else was also waiting. I was like, fine, I'll take this and then try and adapt, because if I think those pitchers that I'm normally get in the 7th, 8th rounds are not going to be there, then I need to change that and try and find the value elsewhere. So I wanted to really hear more about this, DVR. You were just talking about it with you taking an early starter. How did you feel about that one? And are you going to be approaching starting pitchers aggressively or waiting on them, do you think, early in the drafts?
So, I think because I don't want to spend in a snake draft as much draft capital as it takes to have pocket aces. That's part of why I want to be later in the round. I feel like if you want to go pocket aces, if you want 2 early starters, be early in the order, because you'll get a hitter in round 1, and you might get a combo of Nola and Woodruff, or Strider and Scherzer, or
so
Sandy Alcantara and DeGrom, or whoever you like out of that cluster. You might get 2 of those guys behind a top 5, top 6, top 7 hitter. That's fantastic. I don't want 2 early round starters when I have to build a team this way, but I would like to have 1 early on. I think there is a pretty clear drop after Burns and Cole before you get to the next cluster of starters. So if you want one of those 2 guys, pick a spot near the end of the order and then make your combination of starting pitcher and most likely hitter. You could go Burns, Edwin Diaz if you wanted to push Edwin Diaz and get the top closer on your board. I don't really want to do that either. So I think the trade-off that I've made, is that with stolen bases in particular, I really want 6 or 7 good sources of stolen bases instead of 2 or 3 guys who are supposed to get me 80 to 90% of my bags. Because if you lose one of those guys who's supposed to get you 30 plus steals, you're in a lot of trouble if that guy goes down with an injury early on in the season.
Diversify your assets.
Yeah, I think just spreading around that risk in that category in particular is something that I like to do. And because of the positions I target early, if I'm going to target an early catcher, like I mentioned Will Smith in that example, if I'm comfortable drafting him in that round 3, round 4 range, I want that edge in that first catcher spot. I know that I'm getting an elite hitter there and that I'm going to have outfield spots open later. I'm going to have middle infield spots open later because I'm not taking the middle infielders that people are taking that spot. Like, I'm going to still find bags because they're almost always bags. There's only a handful of middle infielders who don't steal any bases. So then you have to go down the board and say, do I like Tommy Edman? Do I like Andres Jimenez? Okay, maybe I don't like those guys. So if I don't take them, do I like the next round of middle infielders? Do I like Gleyber Torres as a guy that should get 8, 10, 12 bags on top of the power and run production? So those are the types of problems that I'm sort of solving as I try to decide at each turn, what am I going to do? And I think there's a distinct advantage of being on the actual end of the draft order. I think making 2 picks together gives you an advantage. I know Ariel Cohen was arguing with me about this when I first brought it up. He's like, no, mathematically, you want more information and it's a disadvantage. And I said, I don't know, man. The way I build teams, like my strength is salary cap drafts, or auctions as people used to call them. Like I'm much better when I have more control over who's on my team. And I feel like getting 2 picks together is more like that than being in the middle of the order and constantly playing chicken round after round after round. So I think between being more patient with steals and being more willing to say, I don't need to lock up all of my saves in the first 6 or 7 rounds either. Yeah, I want one of those top 8, top 10 closers, but I'm going to be a little more agnostic about which one I get. And I'm not necessarily going to pay the top of the board price for an Edwin Diaz or a Clase. It's okay to end up with Ryan Presley or Ryan Helsley or Jordan Romano or one of those guys that kind of is in the second part of that top tier of closers. So it's just going through each chunk of the board and seeing where I really like pockets of value. That's a huge part of determining where I want to be on the draft board as well.
Yeah, one of the points I think that you made that was great was talking about how pocket aces is weird this year. Because sure, you can say it's Burns, Cole, and Alcantara if you want, who I have as my top tier, but really it extends until, I call them the 24 aces of dubs, because they're 24 guys that I feel just so good rostering this year. And sure, yeah, the top 10 of that is different than the 20 through 24. But if you really go after that aggressively, then you can plan around that, right? And that actually doesn't really depend too much on your draft spot as it would in previous years, where, because there's so many of them, you can kind of make that aggression work regardless of the draft spot, and definitely not wasting it, I think, in the first 5 picks or so. Those hitters are so much better, I think, than any pitcher value, the jump above it, saying get Trey Turner, just, oh my gosh, that's amazing, or Jose Ramirez, or if you want to say Julio Rodriguez, bless you, go ahead, and don't sneeze again. But Aaron Judge, of course, but it's such a difference, I think, in that way, that right, if you're in the early first 5 picks or 6 picks, you really cannot afford to take a starter, I believe. Maybe if you want to do that at the end of the first, but again, really 3rd and 4th round, you're still going to have a lot of really good pitchers at 45 and 46 that you can do. I'm seeing Wheeler and Rodon at that point, and that's incredible. That's a wonderful 1-2 stack to go for. It might actually make it even easier in the middle, around the 7th, 8th, to be able to do that just casually, because you can just pick the starter that you want. Whatever's around. Castillo is there, and that's great. Fantastic. 4th round. Wonderful. I'm sold on that. Mike, are you approaching starting pitchers with any sort of difference, 1, 8, 15th pick that you have? How is that strategy formulating for you this year?
So I noticed like 2 or 3 years ago, and this is where Nick and I, you've taught us before, and we differ a little bit. I want to have 3 starters in the first 7 or 8 rounds. Now, in the past, I didn't mind pocket aces, and I was fine, like with 1st round, 3rd round. I agree with you about like the pitchers in the first couple rounds. I don't think you have to go pocket aces or even 1-3. There's enough depth there that you could go 4-5, depending on your draft. Now, some of this is price dependent too, right? Because in main event, when that starts up, we know that those prices get pushed up. It's a whole different ball game. You have to kind of watch where pitchers are going. In a lot of other NFBC drafts, and even particularly non-FBC drafts, you can wait. You can like kind of play that out. You can take pitchers. You can go 6, 7, 8. I think in some drafts, frankly, because
Yeah,
that's the way the value
absolutely.
goes. Yeah. So
Uh,
after that is where I find in the middle at the bottom, people like really push pitchers up and they're too aggressive, in my opinion. That's where I'd rather take some hitters, like maybe take my second closer, maybe take my first catcher. And I'm talking middle rounds at this point, like 11, 12, 13, and hit my spots with pitchers. I don't want to, go pitchers all in reserves. I do want to have a staff, of course, but this is where I find the variance comes into play. And people think, oh, this guy in the 12th round, he's a sure thing. No, he's not. Like we know he isn't, because we know how pitching goes. It's unpredictable. It's variable. Even you, Nick, who's great at predicting pitching, you know that the variability
oh
in the middle
gosh,
and the bottom
it's so
is,
ridiculous. Yeah.
is where it tends to hit you. Something I kind of wanted to return to that DVR was talking about. So something I've started doing as far as prep is identifying my max min guys. And what that means is it's players like sometimes not early, but like maybe I'd say starting in the 5th or 6th round and later. They're the guys that I'm like, yeah, my ranking is below. It's too far down. I'm not going to get this guy unless everything goes right. Or it's a min guy where it's like, hey, I must really like this guy because I have him 10 spots above his min. I want to know those players are before I go into the draft, and planning DVR based on what you're talking about. That's kind of how I plan. I'm not planning to get every single one of those players, but it's the idea of, okay, if I have 4 first basemen, for example, who are like, I have them ranked above where the highest point they've been going in a fairly recent NFBC draft. That's great to know, because I know I'm going to get one of those first basemen. I almost don't need to plan for it. It's like, okay, there's some first baseman in the 12th or 13th round. I'm going to get one of these guys, and that's a place for me to hit that. And I don't have to think as much perhaps about like a Matt Olson, for example, not to keep bringing him up, because I have that first baseman a little bit closer to him, not as good as him, obviously, than the market does.
Sure. To go back to your thing, I think actually we're on the same page about pitching here. I mean, I talk about it more in 12 teamers, where I say, look, I think you can. There's more of a cliff around like about 40 or so, 45, and after that is where I feel there's just an open field of who is the one you want to go for. By all means, jump them. Like I want to take a chance on Reed Detmers, but I don't need to take Reed Detmers in the 11th, 12th round or something like that. Or if someone's really believing in Lucas Giolito hitting the reset button, by all means. But then there's stuff much later on that is incredibly interesting too. And it's what's really fun for me is coming up with that list of who I think I'm going to be aggressive on, and then seeing that they are 100 picks later in ADP, or this guy's even 100 picks earlier than I think. And then you realize how much of that variability is there. So I'm with you completely. Get those rocks right around like the 5th through the 8th round is where I'm focused the most on getting pitching, because I think there's just such a good amount of value there. That's what happens when you have a lot of depth early on, is that means the ones the back half of that are way later than they should be. And then that means, 10th round, second closer, all that kind of stuff. I'm so on board with this. Hitting sucks this year though. That's really annoying. I'm really frustrated about this. I'm like, cool, I don't need to take a picture now and look at the hitter and it's like, well, I don't want any of you. But that's just me being silly. I wanted to shift a little bit into you guys are talking a lot about emphasis of the 1st and the 15th, and there's a rule that I normally have, which is, I don't know if it's necessarily a true one, but I want to see your guys' take on it, which is, when you're at that point, you take one guy that you reach for and one guy that you think has fallen too far. And is that generally how you guys go for it? I mean, it's really about chasing value versus getting your guy. Do you find yourself doing that a lot? And do you think that's the way to go at 115? Or is it more about, look, I got to fill the position regardless of the ADP stuff, and I have to just do that? DVR, we'll start with you.
I think it's a little bit more like the latter. I mean, Mike was saying before, right? Using the first baseman as an example again, if you've got 4 first basemen that you really like that are, let's just say they're $15-ish players, $15 to $20 players, and your turn's coming up, you're probably not taking one of those 4 players there, because you're looking at the board and saying, most likely the next time I pick, at least one of those guys is still going to be there.
Right.
But then you look over at your third base rankings and say, wait, there's only one guy that I have above $15. I'm going to go ahead and just take that player because third base falls off a little bit. You get down to the next group and it's $8 and $10 guys. I don't want to take that hit knowing I can get almost an equal value first baseman later. So for me, it's like once in a while something falls to me and I'm just like, well, this changes my plan. That's just the best plan you can have is having that flow chart, having that flexibility to see a value and understand how you can leverage the opportunity to make your roster actually better. I think you can actually fall into a value trap in some ways, taking a player that by ADP shouldn't have been there. But if you don't know what to do with the next few picks around that to take advantage of it, you didn't actually make your team better. You may have got one good bargain and you made 3 mistakes with the next few picks. So did that bargain actually help you? Like, I think that's something people maybe lose sight of sometimes is I got an $18 player and I should have only got a $12 player there. It's like, well, that's great. But what does that player do? And how does he fit on your roster? That's still a really important thing to think about as you're putting pieces together.
Yeah, roster construction. You hear it all the time. It's not about value. It's not this. It's about roster construction. And I imagine, Mike, you agree a lot with what DVR is saying.
Yeah, and it's something I had to learn actually because I was initially a salary cap draft player. Like I that's how I started. I did that for years. People were like, "Wait, you've never done like a straight draft?" I'm like, "No, I stayed away from those." And in a straight draft, it's very different, and it goes back to what I said before. The first 10 rounds, I think it's pretty much go for value. That's really where you want to max on value. Obviously, don't take like 4 or 5 outfielders in the first 5 rounds. Don't do anything ridiculous like that, or don't take 4 starters in the first 6 rounds. But otherwise, get your value. But DVR, you're dead on. Like in the middle, like you want to be careful. You don't need to take that third first baseman to go back to that example and clog up your utility or DH slot in the 15th round, and then look later and go, oh gee, I should have taken a third baseman there. Like what was I thinking? And you're right. Like you can compound a lot of mistakes by not looking at the board, by not looking at what you need, and not seeing what's happening later. Like I know in both TGFBI and Top Mix last year for me, something I noticed is that closers were going later in my TGFBI bracket than the others, and then in NFBC. And so I waited. I wasn't like, oh no, like I'm going to miss out on value. It's like, no, there's 4 closers on the board. Like I can get Jordan Romano about 30 picks after his TGFBI ADP, or I can get, unfortunately in tout is Will Smith because we drafted 2 days before he was traded, but I can get Will Smith like 35 picks after his ADP. Like that's a good thing to do. And if you're not paying attention to that, you're going to miss out. And that's where you really need to be, alert, like looking at what you're doing and looking at your team, and not just to DVR's point, being like, I have to get the most valuable player here. Sometimes that doesn't work.
Absolutely. One thing I do want to do, on the later part of this panel is really take a moment to just kind of identify that, okay, we're going to be taking these guys in certain places. We know this, right? You're going to, let's say, by the first 5 picks, if you're going for Trey Turner, how does that change how you approach it, right? And really looking at position, we're talking about position scarcity. Well, we kind of know that there was this nice little first base run around the 7th round or so. You got Jose Abreu, you've got Nathaniel Lowe, you have CJ Cron maybe getting in there, Christian Walker, Ryan Mountcastle, this kind of stuff. And how does that change how you approach first base? Does it at all? Same with second base. How are you finding those holes? And how you draft and from where you draft is going to actually change who you can chase at certain points. And I do want to talk about that. But before we do, I do want to really jump into what you guys were just hinting at with a closer run or any sort of runs. And how do you handle that? Because it can be really, really tough. You're saying like, okay, there's 4 first baseman DVR that I'm going to look at in the next 30 picks. But then all of a sudden you see, the last 2 picks were also first baseman. Are you going to jump in on that? Or are you going to stay disciplined to say like, no, what? I'm going to believe that there isn't a run right now.
Yeah, this is always really tough. Experience always helps. I think saves is the thing everyone seems to be worried the most about because the tier runs out so quick. Your circle of trust. If you have 8 closers, 9 closers, 10 closers in it, whatever, you don't have one yet. And they always seem to run off together. Round 5, round 6, round 7 rolls along, and that last group flies off the board within like 6 picks of each other. It's like 4 closers and 6 picks, and you're freaking out because you're like, now I don't have a top 10 closer. Now I'm shopping in these mid-range guys that are dealing with injuries and committees and uncertain job security, and it's an absolute mess. I I think I have to really do a good job of not panicking in order to avoid falling into a trap. If that run happens, you might be tempted to push somebody up and reach for someone because you say, well, at least if I'm going to reach, I'm going to reach for somebody I like. I'll go down to that next group outside my circle of trust. I'll grab David Bednar or Clay Holmes or whoever that player is for you, right? Whoever's that first person is that's not in that group, you might be tempted to jump them up to your next pick. I got someone. The truth is, there's still going to be options later. Like, scarcity is always relative. People can panic all they want. Panicking and taking someone that you don't need in that window or someone who isn't nearly valuable enough for that window, I think is a mistake. So you have to be aware of the quality differences after a run and say, okay, I missed out on this class of closer because everybody else was drafting from that group. Something else almost certainly fell. There's a value of some kind there that you can put on your roster. Take that player and kind of reassess coming back to your next turn what you're actually going to do to address that need. If you try to decide in those 55 seconds when you're on the clock what you're going to do, you took all that draft prep that you've been doing for months and you basically threw it in the garbage and made a mistake, which is the last thing you really want to do, because then make one error, you might start making more. You get thrown off pretty easily. It's definitely happened to me before where I do a couple things I don't want to do and everything falls apart. So try to avoid that if you can.
You know, I know that so well of you draft a player and you go, why did I just spend this amount on this player? And now I can't do all the things I was supposed to do before. My worst example of that is being in an auction draft and having to use the bathroom, and I had my laptop with me because I couldn't miss a thing. And I accidentally bid on Rusney Castillo back in the day at like $16 or something. And I had no interest in this, and it just ruined everything. And I remember holding it and being like, "This is the worst." And I'm just gonna assign that to be, yeah, you jump in on some run or something and just destroys the entire foundation that you've built. So being disciplined about it, and that don't when it comes to a run, I don't think there's this idea that we always get introduced to is that an opportunity arises. And then we feel innately, psychologically, that if we don't take advantage of the opportunity, that we've missed out, right? But then when you realize that the opportunity wasn't there about 10 seconds ago, and you were content and happy without said opportunity, then remember that moment, right? And anytime you have to make a rushed decision that goes against everything else, as if something new has been introduced that is displacing it all, try mentally to push it away. If you weren't planning on taking a closer now, you're not taking the closer right now, regardless of that run. You'll figure that one out later. You have to assess this need that you had at this point, right? Sure, take a moment to say, like, all right, does this change if my future plan of this closer? And do I have a backup if I don't do this? That's okay.
Mm-hmm.
But try making a rush decision that is messing everything up. Oh boy, we've all been there. We all have stories of that. Better than mine, of course, with that terrible auction draft about like 8 years ago. But it's something that certainly gets to us. Mike, how do you feel about getting involved in those runs?
So I agree with everything DVR said. I want to add an important point too. So DVR, correct me if I'm wrong, like last year in your tout, you didn't have a closer, right? Like you finished dead last in the category. Is that correct? Or am I misremembering that?
I think I ended up either last or second to last. Yeah, it wasn't
Yeah.
good. I had one cheap closer. He lost his job. I traded the other reliever I had. I mean, I basically punted.
But you won. Like I'm not bringing this up to call you out. I'm bringing up because you still won tout, right? Like you came in first. So I bring this up because NFBC is where getting a closer is like super imperative. In a lot of formats, you do not necessarily need to have a closer. And it's an important piece of this discussion because we get stuck on, oh no, I'm not going to get the 10th best closer, the 12th best closer. And that's perceived anyway, because we know there's going to be some shifting. It is okay to walk out with none or with like a couple of dart throws late. Other leagues have trading, like other leagues, allow you to, be more aggressive with fab perhaps. And in a standalone league, if you finish with 4 or 5, even with 4 or 5 points and saves, and you make a trade or you pick somebody up in the middle of the season, you only get like 20, 25 saves. That's okay. And it goes back to the value proposition you were talking about, DVR, which is if you're taking a closer, let's say in the mid-range, let's say last year's Lou Trevino, not to pick on Lou, but you're like, I have to have that guy in the 19th or 20th round. I need those saves. even at that late juncture, you're giving up something in value, like a useful third middle infielder or a useful fourth or fifth outfielder, somebody who might help your team, as opposed to Trevino, who just we all kind of sort of knew he wasn't the best bet. We knew he was going to flame out. Getting back to the question about the runs, I mean, I think it really comes down to the player. Like if you do look at the board and you look at the closer, it's not so much the saves, but it's the value. If you're like, yeah, that last guy or those last two guys there, or the two guys left, I feel have value, not just in saves, but in ERA and whip and strikeouts, definitely get that player. But if it's a false feeling and it's one of those mid-tier guys or worse, let him go and just kind of speculate later and make sure to take somebody in the middle where you're really getting value from that player, and not to the point you made, not that false feeling of, oh man, I really got something here, and deep down that you made a mistake.
Yeah, no, I think that's really huge. And one thing to reiterate from Dave Potts that he says a lot is a lot of people make the mistake, especially in NFBC. Could you also do this in TGFBI, where everybody's fighting for the overall, where you have leagues, you actually have your own individual league. And sure, the overall, you can't really get away with a 1 out of 15 or so, or really 1 out of, I guess, 500 or whatever it is, for saves, and that you can't do that. But in your league, you can a lot. And if you focus more on just winning your league, you can really work on that. Obviously, it's not the Roto 1 out of 500, but you understand what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I mean, I'm the kind of person that if I win my individual league, that's a nice prize. I'm not.
Yeah, right.
I'm not
Exactly. Yeah, focus on that. Yeah, Mike.
Well, the other point too about that is you're not going to finish, like, you might totally bleep the bed with saves, but you're not going to finish with 1 point. You're going to make moves, right? You're going to pick people up. You're going to make attempts. So you're not going to win saves, perhaps, but maybe you'll finish, instead of with 500 points in the overall, you're finished with 100. And if the rest of your team is great, you could still make some noise.
Absolutely. And of course, this isn't to go and say, like, okay, guys, do not get closers. That's the way to go. It's more about disruption of your draft strategy to give into a run like that is not as valuable as it might seem, right? That is something we need to preserve and make sure, like, no, really stick to what you've done. You've planned for so long. And the more that you do planning of really understanding the draft position itself, the more that you can really take advantage of the different cliffs and valleys and hills and peaks and all the words I want to use to talk about a flow of a draft. And I do want to do that. I think that's something that, I know that all of us here have not really spent the time. We need 2 more months before the start of the season to really fine tune this and polish it. But there's still some things I think that we can really take away from the early draft pool that will help us understand, hey, if I'm drafting 15th in my leagues, what does that generally mean for the rest of my draft as opposed to being at 1? So I want to start off with let's just say right now that I'm in the 1 spot, and I say yes, I need to get Aaron Judge, right? That is the one I have to do. That means that I'm not going to get those third basemen that we talked about. That means I'm not going to get Bo Bichette. I'm not going to get Bobby Witt. I'm not going to get Tatis, right? I'm not going to be able to get, say, Freddie Freeman, Vlad Jr., Pete Alonso, these elite first basemen, likely not Goldschmidt, maybe Matt Olson on the turn. I will see, that kind of thing. But so let's say you are going for that. How does that really adjust, the ripple effect that happens? Are there certain things that you think that are more amplified at 1 than they are at 15? DVR, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think in this example, just thinking about the type of player Judge does at least a little bit of everything and a lot of power on top of that. He's not a batting average liability, and he kind of gives you like at least the average number of stolen bases you'd want from every hitter to hit your target in a typical league. So really, he's a great pick early in round 1 because you still have all the options available to you. You can kind of take what comes to you with a player like that when it comes back through. I think what I'm always thinking about from a power perspective too is if you are light on power and you end up in the middle rounds chasing the cheap 30 homer guys. You mentioned some of the first basemen earlier, CJ Cron, Christian Walker. If you like that group of players, Rhys Hoskins, kind of the upper end of that group. If you like a lot of players like that, that's fine. But you have to think about your foundation differently to take advantage of those players, because the consistent flaw with that group of players tends to be that batting average risk. And you don't want to completely tank that category. Just as we were saying about saves, right? It's okay if you're not winning batting average coming out of the draft. It's fine. Like, you could be middle of the pack in batting average, but you'd rather not tank it if you can help it. You have to think about those types of hitters that are available at that first pick in those first few turns, and make sure you build in the foundation to get that cheap power later. So if you're thinking about more about speed and average early, that's great from the one spot, because you're gonna have plenty of low average mashers, regardless of your draft position. That player type is there later. So I hope that's a good answer to the question. But
right, I mean, this is the this is the mentality we want everyone to get into. Is, you as a fantasy player are going to be fed all these different articles from everybody about, oh, this is my favorite late round value, this is the sleepers, these are the busts, all this kind of stuff. What is most important, really, that we're trying to take away from this is highlight the opportunities that you're going to have for your early picks. Say the ones that you want, that's fine, but it's going to be different at 12, it's going to be different at 1. And then based on that, you're able to look at your targets for certain positions at certain points in the draft, and really establish, okay, if I am the 15th pick, that means that it's more likely going to go in this flow. If I go for a first baseman and a third baseman, that means I'm not going to be targeting Matt Chapman. That means I'm not going to be targeting Alec Boehm. And in those situations, I normally would be doing that around, say, the 10th round or so. I don't have the ADP off the top of my head, but that means I adjust to something else at that point. And what is that going to be? What is more valuable around those rounds that I like? So if you're going for Aaron Judge, as you're talking about DVR, great. That means you might want to steer away from going after a cheap power guy like a Christian Walker that had 240 average last year, right? You might not want to go after that. You might want to go for more of a higher average guy there. You might want to go for a starter later on, because you don't feel that you have to go for that power with it. So Mike, I'm going to shift it to you. Instead of saying Aaron Judge is your first pick or whatever, I know we focus so much on the first of the rounds, but I do want to emphasize this of kind of how it does translate through it. Let's say you go after Trey Turner with your first one. You've got speed, you've got average in there absolutely as well. How do you think that would shift a little bit for you if you went in that direction?
Well, Trey Turner is an extremely balanced player. I mean, he, just across the board, the one thing about him is it's not an alarm, but he doesn't run nearly as much as he used to run. So you're not getting like 40. I don't think you're going to get 40 or 45 steals. I mean, I know the rules are going to change things a little bit, but I'm just not expecting him to be a like top of the pop steals option. But you're getting everything. Like, he's in a strong lineup. Probably the one consideration with Turner that changes the game a little bit. There's so many shortstops, like in the first 6, 7, like maybe 8 rounds. Like we've talked a lot about like the quality there. That's kind of a game changer for me, because now like I'm looking at the rest of those shortstops and thinking, you know what, maybe I'll take one more of them. And something I've been thinking about trying to do in drafts. We mentioned first baseman before. I might want to drown the pool in shortstops and have 2 and take one, on top of whoever I take, whether it's Turner or somebody else, and have 2, one at shortstop, one at middle infield, and kind of make my opponents, especially in a 15 team, like do a double take and go, uh-oh, like I need to make that move up. And to your point, DVR, like we don't want to make mistakes. But I would love to make other people make mistakes and kind of think twice. So that's one advantage of Turner. I think something that might change a little bit. I'm going to be thinking a little bit more about power. This is kind of the opposite of the Judge equation. I mean, Turner certainly provides some power, but he's not a big bopper there in the first round. He's not somebody I expect to hit 30 home runs. So maybe with subsequent picks, I'm looking more at, okay, like I want to add some 30 plus home run bats. I want to make sure I get this power. I don't want to wind up light later on where I'm looking at my team, my targets, and go, Turner's great, but I have a little bit less power than I like. I wasn't cognizant of it. And the same thing with speed. Like I have Turner. I'm not targeting him anyway, but I'm probably not taking Tommy Edman at this point, because I don't really need a Tommy Edman. I don't need a player like that where it's like, okay, great, I've got all this speed. And to your point, DVR, there's so much speed that comes later. People just ignore it or don't look at it or forget about it. And we get a little too obsessed. That's where I just want to be really careful not to have so much speed. It's like, yeah, I won the category, but so what? Like I'm way ahead and I can't do anything with it.
Yeah, so my takeaway there is, look, if you're going with Trey Turner, then you should be targeting Kyle Schwarber. on the back end. Really double up the Philly thing, I understand. But yeah, you might be going Matt Olson, Kyle Schwarber, Trey Turner with your first three, because I'm seeing 41 ADP for Matt Olson, 50 for Schwarber. And keep in mind, that means they aren't going to be there again, 4th, 5th round picks if you're picking early enough to get Kyle Schwarber. So let's go on the other side now, because what I've seen a lot is either something like a Mike Trout paired with Austin Riley, or a Freddie Freeman or Vlad Jr. with Manny Machado. That changes things a lot. That's often what I would be leaning toward in the back half of it, is going first base, third base, because those are the talented guys going around, 12 through 15. DVR, how does that shift what you do if that's what you're targeting at the end of your first and second or early second round?
Yeah, if I'm going hitter in the later positions, then it's because I've identified some combination of starting pitchers in that round 3 through round 6 range that I feel like people are undervaluing. I think if you are
Luis Castillo, baby, let's go all day.
Castillo consistently available, right? If you're in the back half of round 1, Castillo is going to be there at your early round 4 pick, almost certainly, right?
59 ADP right now for 63, I should say.
Yeah, and even if you want to push him up a little bit, sure. I mean, at the 3-4 turn, that's a normal spot where he's going to go. If you think Verlander is underpriced, if you think Zach Wheeler is underpriced, those guys consistently go in that range. Carlos Rodon, if you think the injury risk on him is overblown, he goes in that range too. Like those are all options, and they all have ace ceilings if it all goes right. Again, it's up to you as a person if you trust everything to come through projection-wise and health-wise for this group of pitchers. But that's what I'd be thinking about. How much do I like those guys? Because I'm almost certainly getting a starting pitcher in the 3-4 range, or maybe I've got some ridiculous strategy up my sleeve where I like a lot of pitchers this year after the first 4 rounds. I think there's a group of pitchers between rounds 5 and 8 that could end up popping up as aces. Every year is going to be different. But if I were the kind of person that said, Tyler Glasnow is going to come back this year, and he's going to give me 150 innings, the ratios are going to be elite, and he's going to strike out almost 200 guys, even with a workload that's lighter than other aces, I'm fine with him as my ace. I'm going to back him up with Luis Severino, and then coming back through the round after that, I'm going to take advantage of Hunter Green still being there. I'm going to get 3 or 4 pitchers in a row because I went hitter early, or maybe I went hitter, closer, hitter, and then I started getting pitching. Like all of those things have crossed my mind if I'm taking hitters with those first 2 picks. I mean, I think the biggest takeaway for me when I'm trying to think about roster construction is it's more than 2 players when you're thinking about KDS. It's more than what happens in those first couple of rounds. It's something Scott Genstead from RotoWire wrote about, I think, 5 or 6 years ago in the RotoWire magazine. It's more like 6+ rounds. You can take it as far as you want. The specific players, yeah, you're only mapping out those combos for a couple of rounds, but the types of players and how they interact with each other, that is huge. So think about the broader strategies you want, the groups of players you like the most, where they tend to go, and let that shape which values you want to take with those first couple turns. I have no problem building a roster the way you describe it, those first 2 picks. Those are great players as long as you know how to put a good pitching staff behind them and as long as you know how to get enough steals behind those 2 guys.
Yeah, there have been times I've certainly done drafts where I say, I really like this guy, but I just can't do it. I can't do that because it means that I'm not able to take value at that position later. And sure, I love Trey Turner. I love Bobby Witt and Bo Bichette. But I really like that realm of the Tim Anderson and the Willie Adames and O'Neill Cruz and Dansby Swanson. And especially at a time where after the first 3-4 rounds of hitters, I'm not liking this a lot. I'm with you, DVR. I'm kind of seeing if I'm at the back end of this, great start of the 4th round. Get me a Rodon, Castillo. I see Zach Wheeler's around there too. I absolutely adore this because I don't see so many hitters that are as massive an impact at that time. I mean, sure, I see Corey Seager at 62. I don't think that he's going to actually be there considering how everybody says, I have to get Corey Seager on their team. So those kind of things, I feel like, yeah, you know what? I might just go in and reach, or not reach, but go and get a starter at that point. But you're right. It's so important to find out where those gaps of value are that you get excited about. And then ensuring that those picks, yes, it's not just about those first ones, but they do lay that foundation to then jump forward and say, great, that means I can unlock this one later on. And Mike, do you have that same feeling, of course, at the back end of your draft? Are you going 3rd, 4th round at all? Or are you feeling like, you know what, maybe I can actually wait until 5 and 8. There's Max Fried that would go past pick 70. There's Joe Musgrove. Zach Gallen's around there as well. Alek Manoah. Do you feel more comfortable with that?
If I'm at the back end and I got like a Freeman Machado, I'm probably going to take one pitcher there in the 3-4 turn. I don't see taking two for the reason you just said. I'm pretty comfortable with enough of those pitchers, like 6, 7, maybe even 8, that I feel I can fill in. And some of it is there's so much variance in how we feel about pitching, not just in terms of how they're ranked, but also in terms of how we draft them. I always find every year that there's one pitcher sitting there for me at 7, 8 that I'm kind of surprised by, particularly in a non-NFBC draft where people don't value pitching as much, where I'm just, wow, I can't believe. I think last year in Tout, it was like I chose wrong, but it wasn't a bad choice. Like, it was like Yu Darvish and Justin Verlander sitting there for me. It was like the 7th or 8th. I think it was the 8th round, and I was shocked. I was like, well, how is this possible? And I made the wrong choice, although it wasn't, Yu Darvish wasn't exactly bad last year. I don't feel bad about.
No, he was great. It was only that second game with 9 earned runs.
Right, I just didn't. Right, and I think, was that in Colorado? Because I might have actually had him on reserve for one of them.
I want to say it was against the Giants.
I think I did have him so
dumb, and I hate everything for it. He was like a 2.4 ERA the rest of the year or something ridiculous.
Yeah, but I mean, to that point, I think in a lot of leagues, like there's just pitchers sitting there where it's like, oh, I have a choice between these two pitchers I really like, and both choices are going to be fine. And that's a large part of what it comes down to. And to your point, it's knowing your board, like knowing how you shift through that, and kind of figuring that out beforehand somewhat. Yes, you can't map out every single thing everyone's going to do, but having an idea of your choice and going, okay, in the 8th round of this draft with this group of people that I've played with before, I know pretty well, they're going to be 3 or 4 pitchers sitting there for me, and I'm going to have a pretty good choice. Whereas in another room in the 8th round, you might be like, oh, there's not going to be much here for me. I'm going to have to push these pitchers up to make sure that I get what I want, and I'm not reaching into the point we all made before, panicking in round 8, taking my number 3 starter who isn't really a number 3.
Right. I think the biggest takeaway from this is actually kind of funny. I remember in 2021, First Pitch Arizona, there's a joke between me and Rob Silver at this point, where they had a panel similar to this about your strategies in NFBC, and the takeaway was really nailing your late picks to fill in the value that you don't get earlier on. And so I asked, like, all right, who are some of those guys? And Rob's like, it is October. I have no idea, because, we're just talking about the strategy of it and really like that's where you should be doing your research and stuff. And of course, he got back at me at First Pitch Arizona this past year for asking that question. But I do want to ask Lisa, get you guys right now, is there a certain position that you feel most confident in that passing early on and ensuring that there is a foundation not in that position so that you can capitalize it in the middle and late rounds and be really happy with that? And that, because that does shift, even if you're 1 through 15 or whatever. Let's say your first 5 and you're saying, yeah, I love the shortstop position. That means that Trey Turner is not the one that you're going for if you have the opportunity of it. And that really does change your strategy. So we'll start with you, DVR. Is there a certain position that you're saying, you know what, I don't think I can justify going for this early on because I want to be able to be in on that later?
Yeah, it's probably outfield, actually, because of the way I'm building teams. I think a lot of the affordable speed comes from the outfield. So I would not double tap early outfielders who don't run and feel good about it, knowing that I need to get those bags from those roster spots later on. It's fine if you double tap hitters and one's a first baseman where you don't normally get those bags and the other one's an outfield, but I would not go outfield heavy early if those players don't offer bags. That'd be the biggest things. I like Harrison Bader. Some people don't. That's fine. I like Ian Happ. They're available in double-digit rounds consistently. I think this version of Christian Yelich is still a good fantasy player, even though he's not an MVP anymore. I'll take advantage of that around pick 100 time and time again, right? So I just think there's a group of players in the outfield at multiple tiers that really round out teams very well, and it allows you to be a lot more aggressive at other positions that fall off more quickly. So I'm kind of pushing back on this idea that outfield is thinner than usual. I think that's just that's a byproduct of what you said earlier, Nick. The hitter pool looks bad because the run environment changed. That's all it is. It's just us not adjusting to the numbers being different from the ball being stupid.
Well, good. I will listen to your hitting suggestions on rates and barrels, of course, making sure that I know what to do when I look at and I say, I don't like any of these hitters in the 10th round. No, wait. Christian Yelich is still a good fantasy player. We should get him on our teams. Mike Gianella, what position is it for you?
Well, that's a good point about the outfield, but I'm going to go with second base. There aren't as many multi-positional, like second short or second third, but they're out there. And, you know, part of it is just a product of the draft. Like no second baseman, at least the last I looked, are going in the first or second round on a 15-teamer. But I don't feel the need to, as much as I like him, I don't feel the need to reach for Jose Altuve or Marcus Semien. There's so much quality, even when you get into the 200s. And some of this, to your point, you know, DVR is who you like. Like, I don't like him, but if you like Gavin Lux, if you think this is finally his year, like, go for it. If you like Colton Wong and you're like, you know, I can deal with the platoon there, and, you know, I'll find somebody to back him up when, you know, Seattle is playing a lot of lefties, go for it. But just so many choices at second base throughout the draft, so many steals, so much power that's tied together in these players. Obviously, it's how a draft works. You're not going to get a Jazz Chisholm or someone, you know, that high level or potentially high level, you know, past the top 200. But I feel the gap between what you're getting in terms of the stats, you know, there and again, so many choices. I feel like somebody can't just take a player where it's like, oh no, they took the one second baseman I want, and I'm going to have to really scramble now. So that's a position where I feel pretty comfortable waiting. And, you know, unless a Semien or Altuve fall, like, you know, around past where they're going, where it's like, okay, I have to take one of these guys, I'm fine letting them go by.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, Vaughn Grissom comes to mind for me at second base as someone I think, that might be working. Jay Cronenworth in the middle of that Padres lineup, despite what you want to say about him. He's going to accrue a good amount of counting stats, I think. Second base. Me talking about Harry, I'm going to stop doing that now. Mike, DVR, thank you guys so much for this fantastic panel. And you know, I hope to in some way connect with you back in 2 months and be like, all right, what is the strategy? What is it? Come on, we got to get it by now from each position. Being like, this is what I want to do if I'm 7 or 8. If I go here, then really just think of the tree, the binary tree. If this, then that, and kind of go down of everybody listening. Creating something like that is how you win your drafts. When we say you can't win them, but you can if you are as prepared as possible. DVR, Mike, thank you so much for being a part of PitchCon this year. It was great talking to you.
All right.
Thanks
for having us.